Rental costs are rising at the fastest rate they have in 20 years. And in this environment, you need to understand the tenancy reforms that are coming through to make sure you're across the latest, both if you're a landlord and a tenant. In this video, we're going to talk you through the 5 key tenancy reforms that are affecting both landlords and renters. So let's have a look here. We've seen that private rental forms an increasing large part of the housing system. Just over 26% of Australian households, which is 2.6 million, are renting through private arrangements. Now, this number is increasing as we see larger number of people in long-term rentals. Now, the trend is actually reshaping the expectations of privately rented homes, and tenancy reforms are rolling out nationwide, albeit slightly slow, in a way to help with these changes. Now, these reforms are important to ensure both the safety, security, and the happiness of homes. And importantly, these reforms are going to help shape the roles and responsibilities of landlords, who are now being called rental providers through the Victorian government. So it's all about having landlords become good landlords. And we've seen with ABS data in 2019, 2020, that there was an estimated 14.8% of households that were residential landlords who received rental income. This number's increased over the years. We've seen it increase from 2015-16, which is only 13.8%, and in 2003, 2010, there was only 10%. So we can see gradually over time, the number of landlords is increasing. And unlike other investments, being a landlord where you're providing housing actually means you're providing a home for someone. And we've also seen with a number of tax concessions for investors being landlords, it's quite generous by international standards. We saw capital gains discounts and negative gearing actually formed $11.7 billion worth of costs to the Australian budget. And I think it's worth mentioning that, look, yes, it is something important to be aware of. If we look at some data here in terms of those that gained most from capital gains in real estate and shares, we can see it was individuals. But not only that, we can see the top income percentile. So the highest income percentile were those that gained the most from capital gains. And when we look at negatively geared or negative gearing, we can see those that are in their prime, their income prime. So from really their mid-30s till mid-50s, we can see they're the ones getting the most negative gearing. Now, I want to talk about how negative gearing might play a negative or positive role in the housing market. But looking at this data here, we can see over the years for negatively geared properties, we've seen since 1994, the number of people having negatively geared rental properties has increased. We've also seen the losses increase quite drastically over the same period of time. And we're seeing more and more investors opt for negatively geared properties, which makes sense because housing prices have gone up so significantly since 1994. It's practically really challenging to find a property that is positively geared. So we can see how much of an increase negatively geared properties have compared to positively geared properties. And my argument here is if a property is negative geared, it means the landlord's actually losing money. So for the tenant to be renting it out, it's actually costing the landlord more to have them in there than potentially finding someone that's willing to pay more rent, which potentially might not be practical. So in a lot of cases, negative gearing helps tenants by subduing that rental increases. We have seen a number of rental increases, and that's mainly due to the supply side of things. And we can see when capital gains discounting was introduced in 19 or 2000 roughly, we can see properties that were initially, most landlords were trying to break even or make a slight profit. Automatically, people were more than happy to take a loss, a massive loss. And that might have a lot to do with property values, people being willing to spend a bit more on a property given that they've got these capital gains concessions there that were introduced. And we can see the number of negatively geared properties based on the median wage. So negative gearing is certainly something that's far more popular with the higher tax bracket, which makes more sense because they get the most benefit out of it. And looking at the brackets and occupations, it is certainly the higher income earners that look to make the most out of negative geared assets. If we have a look at it based on salaries versus occupations. So all things to keep in mind and consider. It's definitely something that is certainly a big issue. Supply is another thing that needs to be looked at because we saw in 2015 there was a limitation. We saw the government come in where they limited the number of investors and number of investment loans that could be written by the banks. And this had a direct impact. If we look at the Queensland and Western Australian market at the moment as too, we can see new commitments for housing over the last sort of 8 years since 2004. And in 2015, once these changes were made, we can see automatically 2015 March 15, that the trend over the last 5 years is for investment loan commitments to reduce. So there was less incentive for investors to get in the market. That immediately has a massive impact because we can see the vacancy rates in Queensland nearly at 0.5%. In WA, same sort of a thing. Vacancy rates at an all-time low, which means there's not as much stock in the market available for tenants to pick up and potentially have that ability to negotiate. There's more power for the landlords. And we can also see home dwelling approvals down. So there's not as much supply. And even when we look at the Queensland market as an example, we've seen net migration up per annum 45% just for the last 12 months. WA not so high. They're about 6,000 net migration. But we're seeing all these things add up. Not as many investors in the market, not as many properties being built. We're seeing more people opting to rent because it's certainly expensive in the housing market. And when we look at the age bracket of those that are renting, those under the age of 35, since 2021, we've got 60%. So there's been a trend of the younger needing more and more tenancies or rental properties because they can't afford to get in the market. And that's what we've seen has happened. Massive increases, lack of investors, lack of property, lack of supply, lack of new properties being built. So let's look at the 5 reforms that are coming in. The first reform is rental bidding. So the ban of rental bidding, which has really plagued the industry effectively where, the property goes to the highest bidder. That's looking to be stamped out. There's looking to be minimum standards for dwellings. So for example, heating included, safety and security in some cases. So making sure that people have minimum standards. The third is property modifications. So a lot of the times landlords don't allow tenants to do modifications such as hanging a picture or doing a vegetable garden at the back. This is a reform that will allow people to do that as long as they put the property back to what it was when they initially leased it out. Pet inclusions, this is a huge one. A lot of people have pets and they form part of their family. So putting the onus on the landlord to establish grounds for refusing pets is a good one. And then the last one is more secure leases. And this is more on the grounds of being, in New South Wales, we saw there's no grounds for eviction. They could get rid of you for any reason. So putting more onus on the landlord to give reason or to have proper reason, as in, for example, they're moving back into the property or having a reasonable grounds instead of just saying, no grounds for eviction, you're out. So we can see these 5 reforms there all helping to make it a fairer arrangement for both tenants and landlords to work together and have a good relationship. Now, the reforms that have recently happened, we've talked about the 5 there, which states have adopted them. So in Victoria, they've banned rent bidding. They've also set up minimum standards for ventilation, heating in 2001. They've also made some adjustments. You can make modifications that are permitted to the properties. There's no unreasonable grounds to not have pets, and the eviction grounds have been updated. So Victoria really leading the way there with all 5 changes adopted. We can see the ACT similarly doing the same thing, taking all 5. We've got limited reforms. So whilst Victoria and ACT has been very progressive, we see Northern Territory, Queensland and New South Wales and Tasmania limiting the number of reforms they've taken up. So taking up of maybe 1 or 3 of the 5, depending on the state you're in. And WA and Western Australia being quite backwards there in that they still haven't made any changes. They've got reforms waiting, but nothing really happening as yet. Guys, leave a comment below if you've had issues with your landlord, or if you're a landlord yourself. Leave a comment. What have you found? How are these reforms going to affect yourself?